Hello, welcome to episode 38 of the Monday Night Review. It's so windy here, I have to tell you. I'm recording from my bed. I don't know what's going on. We were all braced in the UK for Storm Eunice, and the winds were bad and trees came down. But since then, the wind's still blowing, the trees are still coming down. It's cold. It's cold. It's also half term here, so I have 3 little darlings running around downstairs. I took them to soft play this morning in an effort to tire them out. Doesn't seem to have worked. Episode 38. I'm going to try and make this quick so I can get back to the little poppets. Sometimes an accidental dive into Wikipedia gives you Monday Night Review gold, and today's episode is exactly that. I kept seeing notes that I'd written to myself saying Viking Sally, and I thought, she sounds like a total badass. But she's not. She's a boat. And boy, was she unlucky. So, Viking Sally is a cruise ferry. We've established this before on the podcast. I'm not a boating gal. Don't know about boats. Big boats, small boats, sailing boats, ferry boats, don't know. Don't care that much. But so if some of this is factually accurate or nonsensical, don't send me messages because I don't care. So Viking Sally was a cruise ferry. She's built in 1980 in Papenburg, West Germany, and she's originally ordered by a Norwegian shipping company for use between Norway and Germany. At the last moment, the company withdraws their order and the contract goes to Rederi AB Sally, one of the partners in the Viking Line consortium. When Sally took over the construction contract, the ship is lengthened from the original length, which was about 137 metres, which is 449 feet, to approximately 155 metres, 509 foot. And the superstructure of the ship was largely redesigned. Now, I can't go into technical details, but one of the things that was redesigned was the ducktail of the ship, which I believe is when you have a ferry that can carry cars, it's the end of the ship and it tilts up so cars can be driven on and cargo can be put on that way. And the back of it, when it's up, looks like a little duck's tail. If I can find a picture of it, I shall put one up on social media. On the 29th of June 1980, Viking Sally was delivered to Rederi AB Sally in Finland and was put into service on the route between Turku, Mariehamn and Stockholm. I should say that my Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian is absolutely useless. So there's going to be a lot of linguistic blunders in this one. And I meant to ask my mother for pronunciation on things. And then I forgot. So we're just going to have to muddle on through. So the Viking Sally is the largest ship to serve on the route at this time. And she had a few teething problems. She got grounded in the Åland archipelago in May 1984. And then in April 1985, there are some propeller problems. But these are nothing compared to what is going to happen later on. In July 1986, the Viking Sally is en route from Turku in Finland to Stockholm in Sweden, which is one of her standard routes. On the morning of the 10th, near the end of the journey, businessman Antti Eljala caught Reijo Hamar and a man described as Hamar's associate stealing money from Eljala's wallet in his cabin. Eljala intends to report this to the police on board, but as he's leaving the cabin to do so, Hamar stabs him 5 times in the throat with a dinner knife and then finishes the job by strangling him to death with a strip of fabric torn from the cabin's bedsheet, assisted by his accomplice. Hamar and his buddy leave the body in the cabin to be discovered by a maid later that morning. Now, Hamar does get caught and is found guilty of murdering Eljala, and he's sentenced to life imprisonment. There's no mention of his associate 2 years into his prison sentence in July 1988, he escapes from prison with 2 other inmates. I'm sorry if you can hear the wind whistling. So he escapes with 2 other inmates. He shoots a prison guard in the arm with a sawn-off shotgun. And once they're out, the escapees go on to carry out a number of bank robberies together. Hamar gets into an argument with one of the fellow escapees and hits him on the head with an axe, killing him. So eventually, Hamar is caught in Stockholm, and after a few weeks on the run, he's caught. And due to his record of murders, armed robberies, and other serious crimes, he's considered the most dangerous criminal in Finland at the time. More on him later. But yeah, that's not it for Viking Sally. If anything, it gets worse. In July 1987, so just a year after this first murder, a German couple, 20-year-old Klaus Schelkel, possibly, and 22-year-old Bettina Taxis and Schelkel's friend Thomas Schmid board the Viking Sally. They are 3 students, and they've decided to do a tour of the Nordic countries on an interrail pass. Fun fact, when I was younger and people used to talk about interrailing, I thought that there were rails across Europe that you could clip some form of roller skate into, and that's what they meant by interrailing across Europe. I wasn't a very bright child. They've got this interrail pass and they want to do a tour of the Nordic countries. They want to go from West Germany to Stockholm, crossing over on a ferry to Turku, continuing on up through Finland to Lapland, and then returning south along the coast of Norway, which does sound lovely. So the Viking Sally left Stockholm on the 27th of July in the evening. Schelkel and Taxis are sociable, they're really fun, outgoing, and they make friends with other travellers. Schmidt is more reserved and keeps himself to himself and goes to bed early. One of the people they meet is a British man who is on his way to meet up with a Finnish woman he met earlier on his travels. And they also befriend a car part salesman from Finland. So they have a good time. Because they're students travelling on a budget, they don't pay for a cabin, but they basically plan to get their sleeping bags out and spend the night in public areas on the boat. And that doesn't seem to have been an unusual thing. So while Schelkel and Taxis are socialising, Schmidt goes to bed in the main cabin of the ferry and he takes their bags with them. So he's got all the bags and he's asleep in his sleeping bag. And about 1 a.m. on the 28th of July, Schelkel and Taxis fetch their sleeping bags from inside the ship where Schmidt was sleeping, and the couple head for the open air 9th deck on the rear of the ship, where they'd earlier found a sheltered spot next to the ship's helipad, which is very dimly lit. There's a broken lamp. Now, I'm jumping to conclusions here and suspecting that they might have wanted a bit of romantic alone time, because I don't know how warm or how cold it is in July in that sea, but it sounds kind of breezy to me. Anyway, that's where they head off to. At around 3:45 in the morning, a group of 3 Danish Boy Scouts on their way to a jamboree in Finland. I don't even really know what that is, but it sounds great. They're wandering around the ship's decks. I've put, where was their adult? I know I'm a very anxious person, but the thought of Boy Scouts on a ship wandering around unattended gives me the wibbly wobblies. Anyway, they find the spot where Schelkel and Taxis are sleeping, and according to their witness statements, they saw 2 people who they first think are really drunk. They seem to struggle to stand up, and then they realise that both have really serious head injuries and are barely conscious, and the whole area surrounding them is covered in blood. So one of the scouts runs off to get help, and another of the Boy Scouts approaches the couple intending to provide first aid like a good Boy Scout. But he soon realises that their injuries are just far too serious and he doesn't know where to start. The Boy Scouts have alerted the ship's front desk, and they send the ship's on-call nurse and security operative and the captain to the 9th deck. The nurse immediately sees how horrific these injuries are and asks the ship's captain to request a Finnish Coast Guard rescue helicopter to be dispatched to carry the victims to Turku University Hospital ahead of the ship's arrival in port later that morning. There's no time to lose. They need to get into hospital ASAP. At 5:48 that morning, the victims reach the hospital where Schelkel is pronounced dead on arrival. He had massive injuries to the head, which were originally believed to have been caused by an axe. And despite the attempts by the ship's nurse to resuscitate him during the flight, there's nothing they could do. Taxis was in a critical condition with similar injuries, apparently resulting from heavy blows to the head. Later in the investigation, it was said it was more likely to be a hammer than an axe. I mean, every time I hear that, I think about what it must feel like to be hit on the head with a hammer or an axe, and it's just unbearable. A chief investigator later described the attack as especially ferocious. I want to give a shout out to that nurse. In all the articles I've read on this, she's never named, and it's not clear how long she's been on the job, so I don't know if she had to deal with the previous murder, but I'm assuming that her day job is usually dealing with like seasickness, older passengers, the odd bump, the odd scrape, dealing with like serious hammer to the head resuscitation is a lot. It's a lot. So the helicopter that's taken the victims to the hospital returns with the first police investigators and crime scene technicians, and they arrive on the ship at about 6:30 that morning. The Finns are wasting no time here. When the ship docks at Turku at 8:10 in the morning, the police have it surrounded. They want to seal off the ship with the perpetrator on board. And the initial plan is to interview and video record all passengers as they disembark. But they soon realise that, there's 1,400 people on board. So they can't do that. So they decide to exclude families with children and the elderly. It's going to take a fair amount of force to do to inflict these injuries. And also, as people in the biz would call it, it's wet work. So they exclude those with young children and the elderly. So police bring in 3 cameras to film the passengers getting off the ship to guarantee that they've got images of everyone. One camera is specifically for younger men, while the other captures anyone who's acting suspiciously. And they also have police boats circling Viking Sally to see that nothing suspicious is thrown overboard. And I would think at this point, anything thrown overboard is suspicious. So they have detained persons of interest. They have around 20 passengers who are questioned at the police station, including the victim's friend, Thomas Schmid. Klaus and Thomas had been friends for years. They were members of FC Stuttgart, which is a football team in Germany. They'd studied mechanics together, and he later told a Finnish newspaper that he couldn't remember how the idea of the trip came about, and it had taken them a while to save up for it. He was interrogated for hours, but eventually released from the station. There's absolutely no evidence against him at all. The young British man they'd been hanging out with that night was also questioned. He was found in the morning asleep in his sleeping bag with his clothes stained with blood, which he claimed was the result of a nosebleed, which is suspicious. a random coincidence that you have a nosebleed the same time your new friends are horrifically beaten. Don't trust the Brits, anyone. But though Schmidt is ruled out, the British man's interviewed repeatedly, and it's only when forensic studies can confirm that the blood on the clothing was almost certainly his. This is the 1980s, though, and its forensic technology then is not wholly conclusive. And I wonder if they did any checks now that it's more high tech. So this bit blows my mind. In August 1987, shortly after the incident, local fishermen find a plastic bag full of clothes on the uninhabited skerry of Lilla Bjornholm outside Korpo in the Turku archipelago, about 200 metres, 660 feet from the sea lane used by all the ferries going to and from Turku. They leave it there. But when they return a year later, the bag is still there. So then they pick it up and pass it on to the police, and investigators publish the bag's contents, including the fact that there is a glove in the bag monogrammed with the initials HK. There's also some light-coloured shorts, a red top, and some shoes in the size 41. And police stated that some forensic evidence suggests that the clothes originated from Viking Sally. But they don't tell us how they know this or how they've made the link, and it doesn't lead to any break in the case. Over the next several years, investigators traced and interviewed as many of the video-recorded passengers as possible, though some could never be identified, and I'm assuming they never sort of tracked down the HK. The investigators sailed on the same ship several times, hoping to find clues, but they found nothing. As forensic technology advanced, the evidence gathered provided some clues, but ultimately not enough to solve the mystery. There were no eyewitnesses to the incident, no CCTV footage, and no apparent motive. Taxis has no recollection of the incident, which is probably a relief for her, but I can imagine also deeply frustrating because you hope that you'll be able to identify this person. But it's just a really difficult crime to solve. So despite the unprecedented scale of the police effort, the investigation was discontinued as fruitless in the 1990s. But there's more. Reedery Ab Sally had been experiencing financial difficulties for most of the 1980s, and in late 1987, Effoa and Johnson Line, the owners of Viking Line's main rivals, Celia Line, bought Reedery Ab Sally, forcing Sally to withdraw from the Viking Line. Viking Sally was chartered to Reedery Ab Sleet to continue her current traffic for the next 3 years and is renamed the MS Estonia. On the 27th of September 1994, the Estonia departed slightly behind schedule at 7:15 in the evening and had been expected in Stockholm the next morning at about 9. She was carrying 989 people, 803 passengers and 186 crew. Most of the passengers were Swedish, some were Estonian, and most of the crew were Estonian. The ship was fully loaded and was listing slightly to the starboard, which I found out is to the right from the ship in the direction of its travel, and it's listing because of poor cargo distribution. It's got cars on it and cargo, and it's just been badly packed, basically. The sea's fairly rough that night, but these boats are designed to withstand the Baltic weather. It's, nothing to write home about. It's no Storm Eunice. At around 1 a.m, a huge wave hits the bow doors. And the reason I was talking about the ducktail earlier is that those doors were changed as part of the redesign, and it was believed that was a problem. So a huge wave hits the doors, and over the next 10 minutes, the doors had opened and began to fill with water. By 1:30 a.m, the ship has rolled 60 degrees and water begins to flood the top decks. Passengers are trapped due to the rapid flooding, and soon the windows smash and more water pours in. And it means that there's no safe escape for any of the 10 decks. A Mayday call was made at 1:22 a.m. to Silja Europe, which is a nearby ship, but due to loss of power, the Estonia crew couldn't give their location straight away, which meant that vital minutes were taken from the trapped passengers. The ship sinks at 1:50 a.m., 25 miles from Uta Island off the Swedish coast. 852 people lost their lives that morning, and it's considered the second deadliest peacetime sinking of a European ship after the Titanic, which blows my mind because I hadn't heard about this. We all have heard about the Titanic, and this was just a huge, horrible event. The official report concluded that the bow door had separated from the vessel, pulling the ramp ajar. The ship that was already listing because of the poor cargo distribution, and the list increased rapidly so that the decks and the cabins flooded quicker. So power failed altogether, inhibiting search and rescue, and a full-scale emergency was not declared for 90 minutes. Of the 989 on board, only 138 were rescued. The report criticised the passive attitude of the crew. They didn't notice that water was entering the vehicle deck. They delayed the alarm. They provided minimal guidance from the bridge. It all sounds like they weren't fantastic in a crisis. The Estonia was salvaged, and it was believed that actually the redesign by Sally might have caused the problem. As I was saying about the way the doors were done for the new ducktail design, that door was the first to give way. There is a memorial for the event in Tallinn, and there's an open investigation continuing to get answers for the victims' families. In 2019, the police revealed they had a prime suspect for the murder of Klaus Schlegel and attempted murder of Bettina Taxis. They wouldn't reveal the suspect's age or nationality, confirming that the person was alive and thought to have acted alone, and they later added that the perpetrator is thought to have not known the victims. In September 2020, the Turku Police Department finally announced they've solved the case and were passing it on to prosecutors. In December 2020, a district prosecutor announced that homicide charges had been filed against a Danish man born in 1969, who was one of the former Boy Scouts who discovered the victims. The trial started on the 24th of May 2021 in the District Court of Turku. The case had originally been investigated as manslaughter, which has a statutory limit of 20 years. That would have meant that the case could no longer be brought to court, it would be settled out of court. So they changed the charges to murder and attempted murder, which has no expiration date and so could be brought despite it being longer than 30 years. The prosecutors justified the enhanced charges by noting the exceptionally cruel nature of the act. I think if you hit someone over the head with a hammer, there is a lot of intent in there. In June 2021, the suspect was acquitted of all charges. Had the charges resulted in conviction, they would have represented the longest offence to conviction lead time in Finnish judicial history. In October 2021, it was reported that the accused had in 2016 allegedly confessed the murder to 2 Finnish police investigators, as well as providing details of the weapon used, though he recanted this under formal questioning. The alleged confession was made without a defence lawyer or witness being present, and therefore was ruled inadmissible by the court. So even though he admitted to doing it, because there was no lawyer present, that cannot be used in court. So Hamar, the first murderer upon the Viking Sally, was given life imprisonment because he was the most wanted man in the whole of and most dangerous man in the whole of Finland, and had obviously no regard for human life and very violent tendencies. It may not be soothing for you to know that he was pardoned by President Tarja Halonen in December 2004. I think after about 5 years. But then in 2011, now called Andreas Hamar, he was found guilty of attempted manslaughter. So I think he's locked back up. But yeah, I think if you're given life in prison and you've definitely murdered a couple of people, you wouldn't be top of my list for a pardon. I would be quite willing to assume that you may reoffend. And that is the tragic story of Viking Sally. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'm sorry about my complete butchery of all the names used in this. I really had hoped to get them down pat before I recorded. You can't win everything. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do, as always, come and find us on social media, Facebook and Instagram, where it's The Monday Night Review. You can email us at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. Thanks to everyone who has bought me a coffee, signed up to the Patreon. Means a lot, makes a massive difference to me. I always love to hear about your requests and topics you'd like me to cover. And until next week, be kind, stay safe, always check the back seat before you drive.